Thank you, everyone, for being here, and for Mary for setting this up. Amazing group of people just doing incredibly inspiring work that we're delighted to be part of. What we hoped we could do today is talk just briefly about some of the work we're doing with UNESCO and the UN and UNICEF and other groups, and how empathy plays into many different aspects of this. Thought we'd talk a bit about why we're focusing on youth. We'll talk a bit about community, which is really, I think, at the core of a lot of the things we do. We'll touch on some research we've done here and there. It won't be a full research presentation, but just to highlight some things, and then we can kind of pull it together. So, let's see, here we go, good. One of the things I'd like to start off with is the idea of the importance of youth. Pat and I are two of only, there's about 600 UNESCO chairs worldwide. Pat and I are two of about 6 that deal with youth. And it's an increasingly important focus area within UNESCO. And let me just give you a little bit of the background on it. A lot of people would ask us why we focus on youth, why this is such an important thing. Here's some of the interesting things to think about. Half of the world is under age 25, and a third is under 15. Most of these folks are in the developing world. Most of them are in very, very dire need of empathy and social supports, community supports, all sorts of things. Oh, and by the way, for the reference point, we tend to use the definition of youth that's 15 to 25. There's some brilliant definitions out there that take youth all the way up to the early 40s, which I was really happy to see that. Yeah, yeah, I'm still feeling young. And this is one of the biggest demographic shifts we've seen in humankind. And the really interesting part about this is that it's not just one of these demographic blips. Within the scope of what we do, a lot of research is going on in these areas, and this number and this trend is only growing. So in terms of this, by the time we're done talking today, there'll be 6,000 more of, we can call them, these children, youth, and young people. And not to make you depressed, but by the end of it, there'll be 3,000 less of us. We will have our chance, and we've been rotated out of the mix, and these young people will come up and are taking the place. Let me just show you quickly. I think it's interesting to look at this. We just had some recent graphs here just to show you. These are the average ages of people throughout the world. And as we think about engaging youth and how we think about the importance of building empathy, this touches on everything from improving the human condition all the way back to issues of security and all sorts of other things. As we start getting in other parts of the world, you start seeing any of the yellow colors, things like that, are younger average age. The Middle East, people are always surprised to see this one. You think of the Middle East as being a very old region in terms of the population. It's incredibly young. Now, just for fun, any ideas what you think Africa might look like? No? I'll show you. This is Africa. Yeah. Pat and I do work in places like Zambia and Kenya, other places. As a result of conflict, disease, everything else, it's not uncommon for us to see 10, 12-year-olds as heads of household. Zambia and Kenya, the average age is 15, these kind of things. So the idea of engaging these populations is incredibly important and incredibly relevant to the work we're doing. If you think about it, youth have been at the forefront of a lot of our quests for social justice, and it's been based in empathy. Very often they see the moral and ethical blind spots that we've developed. They're the ones who actually see, the things that need to be changed, the inequalities, all these other things. I love to tell a story. One of my earliest memories, I think it was 3 or 4, my mother dragged me to some kind of protest march. She was kind of a radical hippie. I don't know what she was, but it was good fun. Took me to some kind of protest march, and I remember being amazed, just as a little kid, that being surrounded by what I thought were these old people, these old wise people who were like 17, 18, that they were actually taking a part in facilitating social change, that they cared about the world, they cared about the changes, they cared about the inequalities and all the things that were there. So these are some of the classic images. But Pat and I actually get a chance to do work with lots of people all over the world now who are taking up these charges. And everything from movements towards peace, towards gender equality, you name it. There's a whole list of things. And it's pretty remarkable. And the one thing that keeps coming out is that this massive population throughout the world has a very keen interest in making the world a better place. We often think about young people as being seen as problematic or everything else, and that's just not the case. They want to be active. They want to be engaged. They have the empathy in place in many places. But I also want to stress the idea that if we don't think about engaging them, if we need a tangible reason, let's think about why not. And here's some of the examples. If we don't engage this population, if we don't build empathy amongst all these groups, we've got mountains of data to back this up, that here's what you can expect. You can expect early pregnancies, drug addiction, crime, extremism, massive poverty, gangs. Pick your favorite bad outcome. We know that the combination of empathy and the lack of engagement and other things is a massive, massive impact. So I just wanted to kind of frame it in that light there. I won't go through this in too much detail because this is preaching to the choir a bit, but the term empathy, it's got lots of different uses. I'm a community development person by background, and the term community is the same thing. There's about as many definitions as there are people telling you about it. These are some of just the initial ones, and really we like to talk at different levels with these, but really at the idea of cognitive and emotional empathy. And these are two different pieces, and they also kind of, and Pat will talk about this in a bit, fit into the mix between a very clear distinction between the difference between sympathy and also a clear distinction between just having empathy and actually using empathy. We can relate to people, but do we actually act on their behalf? So these are just some of the things there. As I mentioned, I'm a community development person, and I see empathy as a central part of the emergence of community. And I'm not going to go into a whole list of theory here, I promise, but just in terms of to give you some background on where I come from with this. When we talk to people, and if I was to go around the room here and ask us, where you're from, what's your community? Many of you would tell me Toronto, you'd tell me parts of the city. 100 years from now, those places will still be there. Their geographic boundaries, they'll be there, they'll be on a map, but the things that make those places very special for you, that bring in all that attachment, all the social supports you have, the human connection there, may not be. So we have to make sure we maintain these things. And it's this human life dimension, but it's also the ability of local people to relate to each other, to have empathy, to pull each other together, to address their common general needs, to address things that facilitate their well-being. So some of the things here, and I take what they call an interactional approach to community. And once again, not to give you a whole crash course on this, but it's the idea, if you think about it, all of our communities played a really central role on who we are. Even if they were good or bad, doesn't matter. They played a very important role there. Strong communities did wonderful things for us. They facilitated some very, very strong interdependence among people. All the social supports, we had people looking out for us. We had all these different things. And that served a variety of functions. So this idea of interaction is absolutely key to focusing on this. And I also believe, and we're doing some work these days, that it's the combination of interaction and empathy that come together to make something very, very strong. And it may be a bit of a chicken and the egg thing, we're still working on that, but the idea is that they come together in a very, very important way. And I'll just give you a quick example here of what I'm talking about. I got carried away with the PowerPoint and I make silly graphics, but you can get the idea. If you think about any of your communities, any of your home places, they're made up of pockets of people. We call them social fields. Think of them as special interest groups. They can be, they're people that have very similar backgrounds and characteristics. Think about it in terms of, religion, gender, occupation, all kinds of things like that. Very often they take care of their own self-interest. They're very separated from each other. And what happens is we kind of become more and more disconnected from each other. And as we know, empathy starts disappearing there. But there are areas where they overlap. And one of the things I always tell my students, and I try to tell everyone as we talk about this, community is just one big relationship. And how many of you have been in relationships? All right, good for you. For those of you who haven't, there's some websites we can introduce you to. But there's still hope. But if you think about it, think about any of the relationships you've been in. When you first start a relationship, it tends to be very heavily interactive. You call the person all the time, you email, you text, you drive each other crazy, you go everywhere, it's just bliss. After, some time, whether it's 6 days, 6 hours, 6 months, whatever, you start not interacting as much. And it becomes a little harder for you to realize where they're coming from, what their perspectives are. Then you start having massive fights over the most minor little thing. And it happens. And eventually, if that interaction keeps going away, the relationship starts falling apart and maybe falls apart completely. It's much more messy and complicated, but it's the exact same process at the community level. So if we can continue this interaction, if we can continue establishing channels of communication, the ability for us to develop empathy for each other, to understand where each other is coming from, to knock out problems before they become massive issues that are detrimental to all of us, is a really powerful thing. So we often talk about it as community agency. It's the idea that we do this, and that's that the more we interact over common general needs, the more we talk to each other, the more we understand, the more we have empathy for each other. We've seen this play out in lots of places throughout the world where we've done work. We've seen it play out in places where there's tremendous, racial and ethnic and religious strife and all sorts of things. We've seen it in different places where people are strongly divided over whatever the issues are. It's amazing how powerful the interaction can be and the communication among people. So let me just go on to two more things here. The one thing I really want to stress with this is the idea that we think that community is just something that's there, that there's wonderful functioning places that take care of everything. But I can't stress enough that community is not a given, that it's a process, it's a structured thing, and it's a variable. And that as we stop talking to each other, just like relationships we've been in, it starts to fade away, and it goes away, and it's very hard to get that back in place. And with that becomes the loss of empathy, the loss of capacity to take care of our well-being, all sorts of things like that. So it plays a very important function. One of the things that Pat and I, in our research, have seen conclusively is that places that have strong communities, they tend to equate with very stable, productive, just societies. That's a very, very important thing. We get caught up in the idea that we're in a very massive, globally interconnected world, but the vast majority of our lives comes down to our local neighborhoods and towns, villages, wherever. It's those interactions that actually make your life, and your ability to have those connections is tremendously powerful and allows for all kinds of great things to come out of it. So that's the crash course on community. I wanted to give one quick example of I have a great student, he just finished his master's, Kareem Bartanea, and he's Palestinian and Jordanian. And I thought I'd just mention a study he did recently, and it's a program that's designed to build empathy, is what he studied. And it's called World in Conversation, or the Extended Hand Program, or things like that. But what they've done is they've worked with lots of different groups, but one of the groups they work with is NATO. And what they do is they have facilitated dialogues that take place weekly over the course of 10 or 12 weeks, where NATO cadets that are about to be deployed to some part of the world on peacekeeping missions or other things, they interact with people on the ground and discuss life. They discuss all sorts of things. It builds this interactive capacity, and the program has been shown to increase all kinds of empathy. It's been very, very successful. So he just did his thesis on that. And I'll just give you a quick run-through of what he found. I won't get through all the details of it. But some of the things he looked at empathy at different levels. And some of it was the perspective-taking side of it, where, am I too intimidated to go to another country and be afraid of it, and this sort of thing. There was also a scale that dealt with basically dehumanization and how things shape that. And he looked at them individually, but also as a summative scale that he was able to break out by cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. The one thing he found here, and all we have to look at is the last column for now, the two biggest predictors of empathy were taking part in the dialogues, which were heavily interactive and built these personal connections, and also some other measures of interaction that were in the data set. Things like how many different countries had you visited. The ability to have these things. The other thing that was very important was gender. And overall, women were more empathetic than men. And that's got implications for how programs can be developed and other things. But the key take-home was this idea of interaction was essential to building empathy. Very often it's not thought of that way. So we just wanted to mention it there in passing. Pat's been doing some amazing work related to youth as researchers, to involving youth in creation of engagement, all sorts of things. And I'll hand it over to him and then come back and we'll talk some more.
How are you doing? I'm trying to work out, am I Batman or Robin? Dynamic duo. I remember as a kid when I used to watch Batman and Robin on the TV when I was a kid. It was the old one with Adam West in it years ago. And in Ireland, we used to get it at Friday at 6:30 and again at Saturday at 6:30. And this was great about resilience, was Batman's resilience, because always at the end of the first episode, he was about to get his head cut off by a chainsaw. or something. And he's all. And I remember I have a brother who's 2 years older, and then I'd say, on a Friday evening, I'd say, that's it, he's finished, he's not going to make it. You have to wait till tomorrow evening to find out. My brother, who had more wisdom, would say, look, when you look at it tomorrow, the chainsaw will be about 2 miles back, beating, you know, and it was inevitably. Anyway, so the good news about being young, as you all were or are, is that, in fact, we tend to write off adolescence as unworkable with, and it's a myth. So first of all, hands up in the room who didn't do something that you didn't tell your mother that you shouldn't have done. And it's a bit late now if you haven't, but so the point is that certainly John Coleman's work in Oxford has shown that 85% of young people actually do fine in life. And believe it or not, of the 15% who have a problem, Feldman and Elliott's work discovered that most young people age out of their problem. They grow up, which is why one of the theories is to do nothing. And one of the best ways you can support young people, believe it or not, is through what I'm calling stickability as a parent. This is important when we look at what Mark and I are interested in terms of empathy, which will come later. Anyway, so if we think about adolescence, I mean, what is the actual reality of young people and empathy? So, and I want to acknowledge the glue, which is Mary Gordon in this, the glue in the room, the human glue in this. And her team. And by the way, I should also mention, can we import your minister to Ireland? Because she's absolutely brilliant. But if you look at the actual reality of adolescence, the argument that you could make is that a young person takes one of three positions. Apathy, which is the one they're sometimes labelled, that they're not bothered. Sympathy, which we know is absolutely useless. It's nice, but you can't really change it in a shop. Or they are actively empathic. And what we're really interested in, and I'm here with colleagues, Dr. Brennan and Brady and Dr. Brian McGrath, and with colleagues in Penn State on a UNESCO project, what we're really interested in trying to look at is, I hope this comes up, is the difference between when young people demonstrate empathy, this idea of static demonstration and activating. What is it that activates a young person into doing things? Really interested in what are the triggers around that. And the best way we can get that is from the voice of young people, which I'll return to at the end in a very real way, I hope. From the point of view of understanding this, I want to make reference to two pieces of research which we've been involved in, both actually funded by Atlantic Philanthropies, which is an amazing philanthropic organization which have supported many social projects around the world, funded by Chuck Feeney. One is a study that we did in collaboration with, both actually were in collaboration with a youth work organisation in Ireland called Feroiga, but work that was done particularly by colleague Sue Redmond, where she measured youth leadership and civic engagement of young people. And we used the empathy scale in that, and we found that young people who were involved in youth leadership, this is where they got involved in their local community from really unbelievably varying backgrounds. It varied from young people in foster care to kids in not doing very well in school, kids doing very well in school, really good mixture of youth, obviously boys and girls. But one of the things we found in the study was that empathy improved, sense of empathy improved as a result of engagement. We haven't, Bernadine Brady, who's really led on the evaluation of Big Brothers Big Sisters program, which you'd all know in Ireland, and she's here, but we haven't looked at it yet, but we've looked at a qualitative, the issue of the relationship between big and little. And it's very interesting to try and explore to what extent that is not about sympathy. Big is actually about really understanding where the young person is coming from, befriending, and then demonstrating empathy. So these things I think are very real, and I think deserve more concentration in terms of how we look at it. So I want to look at two particular things that Mark and I are very interested in, as are all our colleagues, and this is the relationship between resilience and social support, and then empathy. So resilience, which has often been described as bouncing back, doing better than expected, all those terms you've heard of. Anne Maston's, I think, definition is probably one of the better ones. Positive outcomes despite experience of adversity, continued positive or effective functioning in adverse circumstances, or recovery after a very significant trauma. And Robbie Gilligan's work talks about this idea of the 5 R's for creating resiliency in young people. So the 5 R's are responsiveness, relationship, reciprocity, ritual, and routine. Now, I'm not saying if you have those 5 R's, you magically have everything right, but they are core ingredients, and you can think about how that works. And unlike Batman, who always suddenly grabbed victory from defeat, I always remember with my kids when they were smaller, we used to, I think do they still have the Big Saturday movie, Bernadine? Your kids are, yeah, 6:30 on a Saturday, we have this thing called the Big Saturday movie. And it's usually about an overweight baseball team or something, and they defeat the real slim guys who are real slim, the usual. And always in the movie, halfway through the movie, it was when I used to put on the pieces for our kids, they'd say, okay, we can do this, the turning point, A lot of the early writings, even by Michael Rutter, I think, on resilience talked about it as turning points. But in fact, Anne Maston's work has shown very clearly that it's more about the ordinary magic. It's what you do every day. It's the reading to your kids every night. It's the bringing your kids on lifts, or as my kids are adults. Has this been recorded? It is. Okay, been a permanent bank book with your kids. But I mean, it's the things that we do as parents. It's ordinary magic is equally, if not more important than turning points. And the other way of looking at that is this idea of a weighing scale. So we have risk factors and we have protective factors. And again, Gilligan has this idea that if you outweigh the risk factors with protective factors, young people thrive. Garmese, in a very important paper in 1984, talked about this idea of modelling resilience. And I wanted to look at that, how it fits with adolescence and actioning empathy. So he said one model is compensatory model. That is, you compensate for adversity. Another model is a challenging model, that you challenge positively. And the third one is a protective model of resiliency. So let's look at those and think about examples of youth where this actually worked very well. So one is probably well known to you in Canada is the Central Kings High School incident or case. A case of a child who has been homophobically bullied, and other pupils in the high school started wearing pink t-shirts as a solidarity with the young person. And it's still done to this day, I think. So it was a great example of group active. So here was a case, getting back to my apathy. Okay, I'm not bothered about it. Sympathy is, I feel very sorry for this kid, but not really doing anything about it. But then actively saying, okay, let's see where we go here with this. The other great challenge model was in the 1980s, corporal punishment was taken from schools in England, in the UK. And it was actually, if you ever have time to look at it on YouTube, is the marches by young people with their parents to end corporal punishment in schools. Fascinating, but it was, by the way, the empathy was not invoked here by the parents, it was by the young people themselves. A great example of ending what was assault on children in schools. And the last one then is the protective model, and we're indebted to Nada al-Hadal. When she was 11, she was a girl in the Yemen who was being put into a forced marriage, and her friends got into sleeping bags and slept outside the minister's house until they got the marriage called off. That's a great example of active empathy. And again, that's actually on YouTube. And very funny, she says, if you saw the state of the guy they wanted me to marry, she talks about it very funny, in a very lovely way. So moving to social support, which I'm really interested in, and particularly the work of Carolyn Catrona in Iowa State University, who I've worked with for over 20 years in this area. There are basically sources, supplies, and types and qualities of support that you can get. So there's those that give you the support, formal and informal, having enough of it, types and qualities. And by qualities, I mean closeness, reciprocity, admonishment or criticism, which is positive, constructive criticism, and durability. Those that you know you can stick by and will stick with you. One very easy way of thinking about this is that very often we experience social support as either a honeymoon or a blue moon. So how often have any of us in this room had a bereavement, and you're nearly so inundated with people who want to console you, which is very good, and 6 weeks later you're looking at the wallpaper and nobody's calling. So timing of support is really important. And blue moon support doesn't work. It's not genuine, it's so rare, its value base goes down. A lot of evidence which shows this. Similarly, when you look at types of support, so you have three types of, although Robert Wise's work in the 1970s, originally, I mean, this comes from Cassell's work in 79 and into the, 70, I think, which looked at the importance of social support in cancer originally, all that research that was done. There are three really important types of support. Tangible support, which is practical support, as I discovered, giving somebody the loan of your lawnmower and getting it back in 15 pieces. Emotional support, which is about hugging somebody if they need to be hugged. And advice support which is the most trickiest of all the three supports. But if you think about it in your life, there are probably times that you provide that support to other people automatically, and you receive it automatically. And I think the statistic is that 95% of people in the world have never looked at the instructions on a fire extinguisher. And of the 5%, of those, I think 95% do it for the first time when there's a fire and they're running down the hallway with it. So so the point is that being prepared around support is a very interesting, a very real thing. And if you're in poverty, it's very real. If you're thinking of I need 20 euros or dollars, who can I turn to for that? It is very real. But very often we don't think about these things until we're in panic mode. And I often reflect on I was joking yesterday with the kids on a fantastic school visit that I was a father at 8. We were having this joke about it. But I actually remember when we had our first child, I was 22. My wife's the same age as me. She looks many years younger than me, but she is the same age as me. And we decided we were going to have a Leonard Cohen baby. The baby was going to be born in natural birth at home. We were living in rural Galway at the time, and it was going to be an absolutely brilliant experience. Of course, it was a complete disaster because it went completely pear-shaped. And I mean, the baby was born, but the baby was born in hospital. And so we came back to our house, which was a farmhouse in a place called Headford, and we'd no extended family at all. And I remember my wife sending me into the local chemist to get Isud or Calpol, anything to stop this. The baby had a thing called, or Brendan, our son, had colic. Now, I knew what an alcoholic was, but I didn't know what colic was as a young parent. But I always remember coming to the chemist, pleading with him for something. And a very elderly man, very wise man, he just turned to me and he said, "Who's your nearest neighbour?" And I said, "This woman called Chris Garvey." And he said, "That woman has had 6 children. Go to her. She'll look after you." So I called up to this woman. But the point I'm getting to is she just brought me down. She came down to the house. She wrapped Brendan, which is a way of calming a baby. She realised Mary had the blues. She told me to put on the kettle and get lost because I was pretty useless to her. But she provided emotional support, advice support, practical support, all in one go. So you think that we were in need of that. You think of a young person, think of an adolescent who really needs that and can't get it. And maybe is looking at other people who can, which is even harder again. So if you look at what's that connection, how does that connection actually work? Well, but believe it or not, Charles Dickens taught us this many years ago. In my life, I want to have read everything he wrote. It's one of my, I don't like that bucket list here, but it's one thing. I'm working my way through it. So if you take the example of Magwitch, so in the story of Great Expectations, Pip thought, can anybody remember who Pip thought was the sponsor? The woman in the house on her own? Anybody? Miss Havisham. But it wasn't Miss Havisham, it was Magwitch. So Magwitch empathized with Pip because he saw him as a poverty-stricken kid in the graveyard. And what did he do? He provided practical support. He gave him a scholarship, basically, in the story. These were all very much related to Dickens' own life and his father being a debtor's jail. Then similarly, if you look at empathy in action from an adult to a child, this is more in a peer-based way, not necessarily a good way, but the Artful Dodger had this capacity to give advice, support on how to pick a pocket or two. Not what you would be promoting among peers, but he did give that type of support. And finally, my favourite one, of course, was W.C. Fields, who played in this role as Mr. Micawber, who was waiting for something to come up. So Mr. Micawber was penniless. He could actually offer David Copperfield nothing except emotional warmth, which is what he needed. So The best way, Dickens himself said, and believe it or not, used the word empathy. He said he brought these all together when he wrote A Christmas Carol. He was asked to write that story to try and get people in London to be more generous at Christmas. So Ebenezer went from Ebenezer to empathizer. So think about it. There was 4 ghosts, not 3, 4 ghosts. Remember, Marley was a ghost as well. And he bounces back from each of the experiences. He goes into the belonging space. He belongs the experience through the ghosts. And as you know, comes back happy and reformed. So don't get frightened by this. I know it looks like a pub crawl map in Dublin or something. But this is a very tentative model around activating socialization youth. So you have basically, if you can look on the blue square here to the left, you have social capital, and you have social ecology, and you have society at the wider level, school and community, parents, brothers and other kin. And then up here, I think you've young people, and it gets a bit back to what Ed was saying earlier. I think you can have a young person who's a refuser in terms of empathy, just doesn't want to know, I'm not going to go there, You can have a young person who recognizes it, but although recognizes it. And then I really like the idea of rebellion in youth. I think rebellion is something we should foster in young people. I still am a rebellious youth, even though my children look at me when I say that, but I still am a rebellious youth in some ways. And we need that. We need that very much. If you bring that across then, I think in terms of social networks, you've got the qualities and types of support, and it leads you to a point where you've got well-being and social support interacting well, and I think it does contribute to resilience. And we're now looking at resilience more as ecological than individual, which I think is really good, and you get coping or not coping. It's a very tentative model. Just think about this for a second. The evidence, overwhelming evidence in many of the human disasters that have been in the world, young people have been the first people to go in. And in fact, they were the first people to be pushed aside by services. So think of tsunami. A lot of evidence in tsunami that young people saved lives. In fact, I even know somebody whose life was saved, works in the university in Galway. 9/11, certainly in Hurricane Katrina, as Mark knows from his research, and not least of all in the earthquake in Nepal. I'm just using those as examples. So here, this idea of serendipity, which Bruce Compass has written quite a lot about up in Vermont, this idea of life events, how life events can suddenly change everything in a split second, actually. And how, some of us are fortunate or unfortunate with both positive or negative life events. But what really interests me is that there seems to be something in adolescence which is innately brave, actually, to step in. And that's something that we should treasure and try and understand more about. That's really all Mark and I are suggesting. So I'm going to give you a very personal story, but a very real story to highlight this. This week is the 100th anniversary of the 1916 rebellion in Ireland. We're not part of the Commonwealth. We still can't beat New Zealand in rugby, but we're not part of the Commonwealth. But Ireland is a republic, and the process of it becoming a republic, the great writer Flann O'Brien said that if everybody said they were in the GPO in Dublin in 1916, had it been there, we would have won. But anyway, everybody claimed to have been there. But I'm from inner city Dublin, and I'm researching something. So I made a discovery about my aunt, who there was a rising rebellion in 1916, then there was a war of independence which ended in 1922, and then 1922, 1923 we had a horrific civil war, which has not been talked about in Ireland, a horrific civil war. And I grew up in a household where politics was not discussed. When this came up, it was not discussed under any circumstances. And then I knew a little bit about this, but I made a very fairly recent discovery about my aunt. So my aunt was my father's sister. She was 7 years older than him. My grandmother was an ardent Republican, old IRA, active Republican. And in her home in the middle of the Civil War, she hid guns and detonators and bombs under the floorboards and behind the shutters in the window. And the house was raided by the Free State Army. And my aunt, who was 15, was coming down the stairs, quickly realized the situation, a bit like Ed was showing in terms of, what was going on here, and realized that her father was shot. There was a thing called the Civil Protection Act, which meant you could be shot on sight in the Civil War if you had arms. And my aunt, who was a pacifist, who was completely innocent in this, said she planted the guns. and my aunt did 6 months in Kilmainham jail. And she was so aggravated about the Catholic Church and its role in the end of the Civil War, she became a Methodist, which was a huge thing, and was thrown out of her home, basically. And she went on to be an amazing woman. She ended up making her living out of writing romantic novels, and died in 1993. But it's really interesting because here was a case. So here's a case of ISIS. You want to talk about ISIS? Here's ISIS, in a mad, different way, you might argue, because it was about religion, it was about youth, it was about a form of radicalization in one shape or form for her. I remember when Mary and I got married, we met her in 1982, and she never went back to her home place, which is very sad, I think, because of what happened. But she did write about this, and we only discovered the book in the last 6 months. And she wrote a book called Through the Gates of Babylon about this whole story. It's a fascinating story. But she did, there were 2 reasons why the legacy never came down. I'm the youngest of 11, so I know what my parents did for a hobby. Not unusual in Ireland to have 11 children in them days. But my dad died when I was 7 months old in a very tragic accident, and he was a brother to her. And because my family is so traumatized by my father's death, her story never got heard. So I'm in the process with my brother of telling her story, and it is a very fascinating story. But what's really interesting, when I met her, I wanted to talk to her about my father, because being 7 months old, I wanted to know what she would tell me. And to my regret, I really should have asked her about this, and it's one of the regrets I have. So before I finish, and in a way I think it's very appropriate the way the morning has gone, just in my own head, and certainly from where Mark and I are coming. So we're really interested in youth as researchers. So even if we take the flow of evidence and research from RCTs, it doesn't matter what way you look at this. I am very, and certainly the position that Bernadine and Brian and I would take in our centre is that we're multi-faith around research. We don't get religious about it. Some people do. We certainly don't. All forms of research is valuable as far as I'm concerned, or as far as we're concerned. But it's very interesting that the whole idea of young people and voice is something that's really prominent in Ireland. We've an ombudsman for children, and we've a thing called Dolan Og, which is a young person's parliament. There are various things going on that are very good. But one thing that strikes me is that everybody's talking about hearing the voice of young people. Not enough people are doing anything about what young people actually say to you then. What do you do with that information? That really, to me, is a key question. So one of the things we've done, and I have to acknowledge the work of my colleague Danielle Kennan, who really is the lead on this, although I've been working with her on it, but she's a tremendous colleague. And over the last number of years, we've developed a Youth as Researchers program, where young people are trained in research methods, through workshops and through a curriculum. We have a Youth as Researchers toolkit, which is freely available. We don't, anybody can use it or have access to it. So young people come up with a question that's burning for them. It's not a case that adults come up with a question for them. They come up with a question that is burning for them. They do some research on that, and then they produce a report. But they don't produce a boring written document. They produce video, which and they've actually, there are other ways that they're looking at this now as well, including music and all sorts of drama, but particularly they use video. So to finish, Mark and I are giving you an invitation, but we're not actually giving you a gift, so don't get that excited. We're involved in a global UNESCO research network on children, youth and communities, and it's an open invitation for anybody who wants to be involved in that or be affiliated with it. We've quite a team already underway, but just to say that is there, and we welcome this is about reciprocal support, so we welcome anybody who's interested. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.